Welcome back, and we come to the final video of the course before we get to your midterm exam. I hope that you've been following each of the passages of ancient Greek works in preparation for the midterm, and there will be a separate video coming up that will describe the midterm in more detail. So make sure that you review the text of Hesiod, the text of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the text of the Homeric hymn to Hermes, and now finally also the text here of Iliad and Odyssey, because any one of those could show up as a passage for you to identify in the second section of the closed book part of the midterm. So I hope that all of those texts have come together for you pretty well, and you'll be able to handle them appropriately when necessary. So let's talk now about Homer. Hopefully you had a chance to at least skim through the big massive works of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are not obviously the complete works in the textbook. That would make the textbook gigantic to have them all in there. But you hopefully got a pretty good idea of the contents of the two epic works as you read them. So Homer himself dates around the same time as Hesiod, approximately the 800s to 700s BC. We cannot be sure in the case of either of the two poets exactly when they come about, but you will notice that both of them, Homer and Hesiod, come from right near the beginning of the archaic age of Greece, right about 800 BC, when literature is just getting started after the eclipse of the Dark Age period. There have been disputes as to whether Homer is actually a real person. Sometimes there have been thoughts that Homer might have actually been a woman, possibly a slave, because his name Homeros in Greek is very similar to the word for slave. So it's hard to know really about the full identity of Homer, but it's whom we accept. The only ancient reference that seems to come close to him describes a blind man of Chios. The island of Chios is one of the eastern ones that you can find on your map in the Aegean Sea. And it suggests if Homer was actually blind, then of course he would have been the blind poet. And if he was in fact from Chios, then he was indeed from the eastern part of Greece. And as we talked about in our Hesiod video, that means that he was from the island tradition, the eastern influenced one. And much of what you see in the Iliad and Odyssey does have quite a bit of influence evident to it from eastern works. So I first want to give you a quick bio of him, which is really not very much that we know about. And then we'll get into what's called the Homeric question, which is a long debated subject in ancient Greek scholarship. So as we say, we don't really know much about Homer himself. He appears to have lived somewhere in the east, maybe the island of Chios. It appears that he composed Iliad first and then Odyssey. The hymns are definitely not his. The hymns are, in fact, a later production. And actually, the word hymnos that you have in the Greek world refers specifically to a dedicatory poem to a specific deity at some public occasion, like the hymn to Demeter, like the hymn to Apollo, the hymn to Hermes, the hymn to Dionysus, and many others that we have surviving. They are written in the epic meter, very similar to the long epics that are associated with Homer, but they're specifically meant to worship a specific deity on a specified occasion. So you should be careful when you're talking about a hymn to make sure that you use the title hymn italicized, because the hymn italicized refers to the title of the ancient Greek work. The hymn in the ancient Greek style is not a hymn in the modern sense, like a church hymn. Those are two entirely different things. So be careful when you're writing your essays not to say hymn lowercase h-y-m-n. That is inaccurate, and it will get you a point strike if that happens. Okay? So the hymns that we know of are attributed to Homer and are referred to frequently as the Homeric hymns, but are not actually his works. The only two works ascribed to him are the Iliad and the Odyssey. In fact, it is unlikely that Homer composed these works in their entirety as we now have them. It is much more likely that Homer was an oral bard, and that his works were later compiled into the longer works as we now have them from individual pieces of song work here and there, smaller stories brought together to make the much longer story. It's somewhat similar to the Japanese epic Genji, which were written by Lady Murasake for the Japanese court. The individual stories there too were eventually brought together in order to make the longer epic. These two works eventually were brought together into their 24-book compilation, as we now have them, by two scholars from the Hellenistic world, one named Aristophanes, not the same as the comic playwright, and then the other named Aristarchus. And it's their work at the Alexandrian Library of putting together the texts, whom we can thank for the texts of Iliad and Odyssey in their 24-book setups, as we now have them. Okay, so what is in fact the Homeric question? It is actually the question of whether Homer did actually compose the works orally or whether he did in fact commit them to writing, were the traditions in general that we know of from Homer brought down orally or in writing. One exploration of this question came about from a scholar named Adam Parry, who unfortunately died quite young. But Adam Parry explored folk tales written in Croatia and also composed orally in Croatia as well. And he found that Croatians were dependent on specific repetitious formulae that would come up repeatedly in the epic works. And when you read Homer's works, you'll notice a lot of repetition of formulae like swift-footed Achilles, gray-eyed Athena, white-armed Hera, laughter-loving Aphrodite. Sometimes in places where really the epithets don't really fit in the story very well. It is likely that those repetitious formulae were used as refrains, probably in order to help the poet compose the work more easily. And also, it would be kind of like a catchy refrain that, if you think of, say, a rock song or a rap song, where there's some snappy rhythm or some snappy set of words that keep coming over and over again to make the song more memorable for you. Probably being able to hear swift-footed Achilles, the swift-footed one, gives the epic poet a bit of pop in his poetic singing to be able to get the audience roused up. Here it is, Achilles. He's the swift-footed one. So some of that probably comes into it as well, as to the way that these two epics were composed. But the main thing is recognizing that there's quite a bit of orality to be found in the words of the two Homeric epics. It's important to understand that these epics were in fact originally meant to be sung. They could have been performed publicly in some kind of large performance, that it could have been performed more privately at, say, a dinner party, or even among soldiers at a campfire or any other place. A bard could sing in many different places. In Odyssey, we have the bard Demodocus, who helps Odysseus to sing the tales of his various adventures, and so on. So again, orality and epic transmission is quite important here. Now, epic itself is an involved subject that I'll just cover briefly here. Epic is a genre, very specific in the ancient Greek world. It refers to a particular meter that is called dactylic. I'll write that for you up here. Dactylic, D-A-C-T-Y-L-I-C. A dactyl is this beat, bum, bum, bum. Now, you're maybe familiar from your days reading Shakespeare in high school English with the iamb, which goes bum, bum. So you have iambic pentameter, like to be or not to be. That is the question in Hamlet, which goes bum, 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 bum. But a dactyl is bum, 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 long, short, short. And the epic meter is dactylic hexameter, which means that there are 6 of them, except that you drop a beat on the last rhythm. So it would go bum, 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 bum. Okay, so it goes all the way through 5 beats of dactyls, and then finally those last 2 beats at the very end. You can also, however, make it spondaic. There's another similar foot called a spondee, which is 2 longs, as opposed to the long, short, short that you get with the dactyl. The long beat replaces the 2 short beats. So dactyl is long, short, short, and a spondee is long, long. So If you want a very quick rhythm, you could get. Whereas if you want a very slow rhythm, you go. And therefore it will slow down the rhythm. It might make some kind of dramatic effect. Like for instance in Virgil's Aeneid, when the Cyclops comes down the hill, stomping down monster, rend and form and gensque, lumina, jump, jump. And you have all these boom, boom, boom footsteps that are all played out with the spondees. Okay, so the meter is very specific to epic. It's actually a very complicated one to compose in, and it works very well in both Greek and Latin if one knows how to do it. It's not so great in English. Longfellow gave it a try in all of his poems, and you get an effect like, this is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, which sounds very clunky. And the problem is that English has consonants at the end of most of its words and syllables, so that you can't really line up the words very well with the meters. If you try, it just doesn't sound right. This is the forest primeval. It's very awkward. But because both Greek and Latin have words that end primarily in vowels, just like Romance languages do today, it's much easier to compose in these meters in those languages. So the beginning of Homer's Iliad is Mainin Aeda Thea Piliagio Kaleos Ulamanein. This is the story of the Iliad. Sing, O goddess, the wrath of Achilles, the destructive wrath. That's the approximate translation of those Greek words. And then in Latin you get Arma Rumque Cano, Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam. Single muse. Or I sing a muse of a man and of arms who traveled his way driven by fate to Italy. So again, the effect is much better in Greek and Latin because the composition of the words allows for a much smoother flow of the words. And again, this is one of the most stately and well-respected meters in both the Greek and Roman worlds. Although epic was its primary use, it could be used for other types of works as well. However, in the narrow Greek scholarly definition, the only way you could get an epic poem is if you were describing some mythological story that was great, grandiose, and you had special kinds of characters in it, gods and heroes, and some kind of major event like the Trojan War or the Seven Against Thebes or the story of Jason going off to get the Golden Fleece or some other major mythical event occurring in the poem. So the dactylic poetry that Hesiod wrote, technically from the Greek standpoint, would not be epic because it's not describing a mythic story in the same way, even though the meter does match. Also, the Romans wrote satire, which was also written in the same epic meter, but that was also not epic because, again, it's not describing a mythic story in the same way. All right, so that's a little bit about epic. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey, although they appear to us as self-stating poems, actually are not really. They are part of a much larger epic cycle that we've lost today. It's a whole series of poems written also in epic, and most of them much shorter than the 24-book long Iliad and Odyssey, but which would have told the entire story of the Trojan War. There was also a different cycle that we've lost almost completely that would have described the whole Theban story about Oedipus, House of Laius, and Antigone, and all, the Seven Against Thebes, and so forth. So a cycle is a whole group of poems that tell one long narrative all together as a big unit. And we are fortunate to have some later scholars who give us summaries of those lost poems so that we're aware that Iliad and Odyssey actually do fit in this big cycle. So we're aware that there would have been a creation story, but probably not unlike Hesiod's Theogony to start it off. There was a description about what happened at Thebes. Probably somewhere in there was a description of the Golden Fleece. And eventually it got into the whole background about the Trojan War with the judgment of Paris, the apple, everything else, the actual campaign over to Troy itself, sacrifice of Iphigenia along the way. the arrival at Troy, the indecisive 9 years, then would finally have come Iliad, which is actually 24 books, all about 3 weeks of the war, basically, and most of it actually only a couple of days. And then after the death of Achilles, then you would have had the whole dispute over the arms, Ajax's suicide, Odysseus eventually coming up with a scheme of the Trojan horse, the construction of the horse, the scheme to get it inside the city, sign on the lyre, as we see in Virgil's Aeneid, then the actual sack of Troy itself, which takes up one short poem, and then everybody's efforts to get home, including Odysseus' trip home, that's the Odyssey. And then there was a last poem that described Odysseus' other son, Telegonus, his illegitimate son with Circe, who eventually ends up tracking him down and unintentionally killing him when he ends up once again leaving Ithaca and going up to northern Greece. So all that together would have been the full scope of the epic cycle that would have described the Trojan events all as a whole thing. So all that is left to us intact is the Iliad and the Odyssey. So if you may have wondered why it seemed like these poems were kind of disjointed, why like they were starting in the middle of a story, so to speak, that's the reason. They're actually continuations of other poems that we in fact have lost. So the Iliad itself is the more violent of the two epics. It's driven by the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon over the possession of Agamemnon's trophy prize, Chryseis. He is informed by the prophet Calchas that he has to return Chryseis to the priest Chryses, her father. Chryses prays to Apollo when originally Agamemnon refuses to return her, and Apollo spreads plague all around the Greek army. Apollo was on the Trojan side by shooting arrows down onto the Greek soldiers and killing many of them, not only with the arrows themselves, but also with the sickness. So eventually Agamemnon agrees to release Chryseis, but only if he gets another prize to replace her, and that ends up being Achilles' dear prize, Briseis. That is most unfortunate because Achilles goes into a rage at being treated that way, dishonorably, and that's what sends him into his sulk that induces him to remain outside of the action. So much of the action of Iliad is really centered on this dispute between Achilles and Agamemnon, particularly the weakening of the Greek army with Achilles' departure from the scene. Eventually, however, when the Greek army gets into a crisis over some ships that get burned, Patroclus is induced to go into the battle himself, and he dresses up in Achilles' armor. As a consequence, Hector ends up cutting down Patroclus with the assistance of Apollo. When that happens, Hector, of course, is the Trojan hero, the son of Priam. When that happens, there is a big fight over Patroclus' body, and eventually the Greeks manage to rescue the body and to rescue the armor. The problem now, of course, is that who is in fact supposed to get the armor itself. So later on, of course, that becomes a big problem. Now, what happens is that Patroclus actually, his body is brought back to the Greek army. The Trojans managed to strip Patroclus' body of the armor, the original Achilles' armor. So Achilles ends up getting divine armor made for him at the behest of his mother Thetis, the goddess, when she goes and begs for help from Zeus. So Zeus agrees, and the Cyclops manufacture new armor for Achilles. This is the armor that eventually will become the source of the dispute between Achilles and between Odysseus and Ajax after Achilles' death. All right. Well, for right now in the Iliad, Achilles is so angry at the loss of Patroclus that he ends up going back into battle. But now it's not to fight against the Trojans as a whole, but only to fight against Hector. And so eventually he and Hector square off in a duel. Hector actually runs away initially, but the goddess Athena plays a trick on Hector, disguising herself as one of Hector's confidants, and Hector ends up turning back and facing Achilles. Achilles, it turns out to be much stronger than Hector in the duel, And eventually, of course, with the help of Athena, eventually Hector is cut down. And then Achilles drags Hector's body around the tomb of Patroclus, thereby violating burial customs. Eventually, King Priam, with the help of Hermes, is able to get into Achilles' tent and is able to ransom the body back. And finally, for 10 days, is able to observe a period of truce with the Greeks while he and the Trojans carry out a proper funeral procession and funeral games for Hector. Prior to that, in fact, Achilles also carried out some games of his own in Book 23 of the Iliad on behalf of Patroclus. So as we talked about in the Chapter 9 video, there's a lot of attention paid to death, and in general, no matter what else is going on, whatever other disputes, the occurrence of death, especially in war, receives universal tribute from Greeks and other peoples on both sides of the divide in the war. So that's a basic run-through of Iliad. Main thing that seems to come across here is that the humans are suffering for what the dispute that the gods themselves started. And obviously the Trojans are responsible for their trouble in the sense that they have Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, in their possession. Helen was originally the queen of Sparta, who got spirited away somehow by Paris, one of the Trojan sons of King Priam, when he was an ambassador over to Sparta. So that's what starts all the trouble, and nobody is able to resolve this conflict peaceably. Of course, the gods don't want it that way because they want the city of Troy destroyed, and so all of this is going to eventually doom Troy. The problem, of course, with the judgment of Paris that started all this, and that's why it was a divine conflict, is that we have the beauty contest among Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite that's sparked at the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, Achilles' parents eventually, by Eris, the goddess of strife, who throws an apple into the middle of the celebration, which says "for the fairest" on it. And that's why the three of them start fighting over it. So Zeus throws the apple away, and it lands in the field of Paris the shepherd. He ends up meeting these three goddesses, awards the apple to Aphrodite because Aphrodite promises him not something boring like power or something boring like wisdom, but something really exciting like a really beautiful woman, Helen. And so because he takes Helen away, and because the two goddesses, other goddesses who didn't get the apple want Troy destroyed, that's what all dooms Troy. So humans and gods interact in a really, really destructive manner in Iliad. The gods even get down in the middle of the fighting along the way. They start disputing amongst each other, and they treat it, as I say, like a big game. They're actually smiling and laughing, and nobody seems to pay attention to the effect on the humans. The only time that we really see the gods unhappy about anything is when Zeus loses his mortal son, Sarpedon. And in fact, it's the loss of Sarpedon that eventually is going to bring Patroclus into the battle that will finally lead him to against Hector, because Patroclus is the one, in fact, who kills Sarpedon. So I'm sorry, he's led into the duel with Hector that finally cuts him down. Okay, so Iliad is a really tragic epic poem with all sorts of very unfortunate interlocked occurrences between gods and heroes that end up really making nobody look that great. And Euripides will have a commentary on the Trojan War in his quite damning play, Trojan Women, in which the Greeks look pretty bad because they picked on this city and end up having to take prisoner all of the hapless women of the city as slaves. So it was really quite a sad war, and the Greeks themselves do not appear to have celebrated themselves or patted themselves on the back that much for having carried out this victory. So now we go turn finally to Odyssey. Homer's Odyssey is about the hero Odysseus trying to get himself home. He is steadfast about arriving home with the help of the goddess Athena. She respects him because he's very clever and wise, and she's herself devoted to wisdom. Odysseus has, as you can well imagine, a number of misadventures along the way. including the encounter with the Cyclops, as well as the encounter with the Lystrigonians, the cannibals. So he keeps on losing men along the way, and it's in fact his fate, according to the oracle, that he will arrive home alone after having lost all of his men. So the points that come across about Odysseus is that despite the tragic aspect of his character, because he in fact will not be able to save anybody else other than himself, at the same time he is able to worm his way in and out of situations on the basis of his wit. And he does have enough heroic strength of his own that he's able to survive with his physical strength as well. There are several points along the way, for instance, when he ends up adrift at sea swimming, he's able to hold out there. And he does eventually arrive in the land of the Phaeacians, a little bit north of Ithaca, and the Phaeacians finally get him home. And the Phaeacians themselves will suffer quite badly at the hands of the god Poseidon, who will actually bury their land under stone for having helped Odysseus. So Odysseus himself comes off as a reasonably okay person, but he does have some problems. We already mentioned the mishap with the Cyclops when he gave away his name. The Cyclops, unfortunately, is also the son of the god Poseidon. Poseidon already did not appreciate Odysseus because Odysseus boasted that he was able to assist the Greeks without the help of any of the gods. Poseidon was furious about this. And now Poseidon is even more furious at Odysseus because of the wounding, the blinding of his son, the Cyclops. So Poseidon makes Odysseus' life hell time and time and time again, but he cannot actually slaughter Odysseus because of the fate protecting Odysseus to eventually arrive home to Ithaca. So Odysseus, in that sense, is a very persistent hero who is able to win out when all the other comrades that he's with eventually are all defeated by their circumstances. And Odysseus has practically lost everything and everyone in his life who mattered. He does encounter quite a few women along the way who all have effects on his journey, such as Circe the witch, who instructs him to go to the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias as to how to appease Poseidon. After he loses his men, when they kill the cattle of the sun god and are then punished with a thunderstorm, then Odysseus, cast adrift, arrives at Calypso's island and stays there for a long period of time. But eventually, Athena gives a behest to Zeus, and Zeus sends Hermes down to tell Calypso to release Odysseus. Then Odysseus almost gets home to Ithaca, but then there's a storm once again, and he is blown to the Phaeacians, where he encounters the daughter of the king and queen Nausicaa. Then he's brought in to that particular city, and he gets to tell all of his various adventures. So all of the adventures that we see of Odysseus in the poem are actually his retelling of them, not as they were actually happening. Then the Phaeacians get him home to Ithaca, and when he arrives at Ithaca, he has to steel his mind and steel his heart, not to break in right away. He has to get himself protected first. So he meets with his shepherds outside the house, and Athena turns him into a beggar. He gets into the house, and the only reason why he can be received is that his dog recognizes him and actually dies upon seeing him, Argos, and his nurse URI CLA395 recognizes him because he has a scar from childhood. And so with their help, Odysseus is able to maneuver things around in the house itself, and eventually he confronts the suitors and cuts them down, but he also purifies the house afterwards. And finally, in book 23, Odysseus meets Penelope, and Penelope has been waiting all this time. Now, there's actually a puzzling thing about the text here. The two scholars I mentioned before, Aristophanes and Aristarchus, did not like the way that the poem ended after this, with a lot of random incidents, like Odysseus meeting his father Laertes, and eventually a final confrontation between the families of the dead suitors and Odysseus himself, where Athena basically once again gives a entreaty to Zeus, and when Zeus finally agrees, Zeus sends a lightning bolt down in the middle of the battle that's about to happen, and Athena comes down and says, "Stop," and they all just stop, and then that's the end of the poem. It's very abrupt, and the two scholars actually thought that the poem was really supposed to stop in the middle of what's now book 23 with the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope. So we're not actually sure if the 24 books as we now have them really were part of the original book, but that is in fact how we have them, and that's how Odysseus' story is told to us. So I hope that you were able to get through both Iliad and Odyssey in good shape, that you really did enjoy them. And our next videos will now turn to the midterm exam. We'll get you through that. And then on the other side of the exam, we'll get you into Greek tragedy. We'll see you on the other side of the exam to discuss Athens, its history, and Greek tragedy.